The bus was packed, the air thick with the weight of a typical late afternoon in Birmingham, Alabama. Every seat was taken, with passengers standing, gripping the metal poles as the bus hummed along the streets. The city seemed to close in, the diesel fumes mingling with the constant murmur of voices, a steady undercurrent of everyday noise. In the middle of it all, a young man sat in his early 20s, his sharp jawline and sense of entitlement as evident as the arrogance in his voice. His words sliced through the murmur of the bus. "How could you forget that, Mum?" "Seriously, it's embarrassing," he shouted, his hands gesturing wildly in frustration. Beside him sat his mother, an elderly woman with silvery hair and the softness of age. Her tired, kind eyes darted nervously, her hands fidgeting with the straps of her purse. She looked down, avoiding the disapproving stares from the surrounding passengers. "I'm sorry, Nathan," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "I thought I put it in the bag before we left." The young man's frustration surged again. His head fell back dramatically as though the world had personally betrayed him. "You always do this," he snapped, his voice louder now, meant for everyone. "It's like you can't keep track of anything. No wonder Dad got frustrated with you." The words hung in the air, and the collective gasp from the surrounding passengers was immediate. A woman near the front shot a disapproving glance, while a man further back muttered something under his breath. But no one spoke up. Not yet. In the back of the bus, a tall man sat straight, his military uniform neatly pressed. His name tag read Gaines, though no one paid much attention. His presence was calm, almost imposing in its quiet authority. The rows of medals on his chest spoke of years of service, but his expression remained unreadable. As Nathan's tirade continued, Gaines's eyes flickered briefly toward the scene unfolding before him. His jaw tightened just slightly, almost imperceptibly, but he didn't move. The elderly woman beside her son shrank in her seat, trying to disappear. She whispered, "Please, Nathan, not here. Let's talk about it later." "Talk about it later?" Nathan's voice cracked with rising anger. "You don't get it, do you? You ruin everything. This time, you've gone too far." An uncomfortable silence stretched through the bus. Passengers exchanged uneasy glances, unsure of whether they should intervene or simply endure the scene. A teenager in the corner pulled out her phone, pretending to scroll, but angling it just enough to catch the scene unfolding. Yet, no one spoke. The air felt heavy, as though the tension would explode any moment. Gaines exhaled softly, the sound carrying weight beyond its faintness. His gaze shifted, locked now on the elderly woman, before returning to Nathan. There was a stillness about him, as though waiting, calculating the exact moment to act. As Nathan's words grew sharper, the unease in the bus deepened. The once muted conversation ceased altogether, replaced by the harshness of the young man's insults. "Can't you do anything right?" Nathan sneered, leaning closer to his mother, who instinctively shrank back. "You're so useless sometimes." The elderly woman's face crumpled at the words, and a single tear slipped down her cheek. She quickly wiped it away, hoping no one saw. But, of course, everyone did. The discomfort spread through the bus like wildfire, and passengers who had been pretending to ignore the scene suddenly couldn't look away. The teenager recording the scene tapped her friend's shoulder. "This is gonna blow up online," she muttered under her breath, but her friend just shook her head, her voice barely audible. "It's just sad." Gaines shifted in his seat, his hands gripping the edges now, his posture straightening ever so slightly. The change in him was subtle but undeniable, like a quiet storm gathering strength. As Nathan's anger began to spiral again, the tension in the air seemed to thicken. Then, finally, a voice broke through. Enough, the voice belonged to an older woman a few rows ahead. She turned slightly in her seat, her eyes filled with disapproval. "Don't you think you've said enough?" Nathan froze. For a moment, he seemed startled by the interruption. His face twisted, his scowl sharp. "This isn't your business, lady," he snapped. Before the confrontation could escalate, Gaines stood up. His presence was immediate, overwhelming. Tall and imposing, his military uniform sharp against the dull colors of the bus. The hum of the engine seemed to fade as every eye on the bus turned toward him. Slowly, with deliberate steps, he made his way down the aisle, the sound of his boots the only noise breaking the heavy silence. As Gaines neared, Nathan's earlier bravado faltered. He shrank back, his defiance crumbling under the weight of the older man's calm, steady gaze. The passengers watched with bated breath. This was the moment they had all been waiting for, but none of them knew what would happen next. Gaines stopped just a few feet away from Nathan. His towering figure cast a long shadow, and his piercing gaze seemed to bore right through the young man. He looked at Nathan, then shifted his eyes toward the elderly woman, her tear-streaked face a silent testament to the cruelty she had endured. Gaines exhaled, his breath steady, before speaking in a voice that carried authority. "I wasn't going to say anything," he began, his tone deep and measured. "But sitting back and watching this, that's not something I can do." His words came softly, yet they felt like a heavy truth settling on the air. "Ma'am," he said, his tone almost tender, "you deserve respect, especially from your own blood." The entire bus seemed to pause, caught in the weight of his statement. Nathan turned toward him, confusion flickering across his face as Gaines straightened, his voice taking on a firm edge. "You remind me of someone I used to know," he continued, narrowing his eyes, his words deliberate. "Someone who thought they had all the time in the world to say sorry." Nathan blinked, still not understanding. "What are you talking about?" he asked, but Gaines only tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "I served 20 years in the military," he said, his voice growing quieter with every word, as if the past were too heavy to carry any longer. "I've been to places you wouldn't believe, done things that still haunt me every single day." He paused, the gravity of his next words sinking in. "But nothing haunts me more than the day I buried my mother." The bus fell into a deathly silence. It was as if the hum of the engine, the world outside, and every sound had disappeared. Gaines continued, his tone thick with pain. "I was a young man, full of myself, thinking I knew better than the woman who raised me." His eyes turned inward, reliving those moments. "She'd call, ask how I was doing, and I'd brush her off. 'I'm busy, Mom,' I'd say. 'I'll call you later.' But later never came." Nathan shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The bravado he'd shown earlier had dissolved, leaving only the raw vulnerability of someone who hadn't realized how much they'd taken for granted until it was too late. Gaines moved closer, his voice dropping even lower, almost a whisper. "Do you know what it feels like to stand over a casket, wishing for just one more chance to say I'm sorry? To tell her that she mattered to you, that you loved her, but you can't, because it's too late?" The tension in the bus was suffocating. Every passenger leaned in, hanging on to Gaines's words, the silence palpable. Even the elderly woman at the front was wiping her face, her hands trembling as she fought to keep her composure. Gaines leaned slightly toward Nathan, his tone sharp and urgent. "Don't be the kind of man who waits until it's too late," he said, his voice cutting through the stillness. "That's a regret you'll carry with you forever." Nathan's face flushed. His lips parted as though he wanted to speak, but no words came. His hands gripped the fabric of his jeans, and his head lowered as if he could not face the weight of what had been said. The bus seemed frozen in time, the moment thick with the understanding that no one dared break. Then, in a quiet voice that shocked everyone, Nathan spoke. It wasn't defiant, wasn't angry, it was small, vulnerable. He faltered, swallowing hard, I didn't mean to hurt her." The words hung in the air, fragile as a thread, quivering with guilt and regret. The elderly woman's eyes widened, and her lips parted in surprise, but she said nothing, her silence now echoing with unspoken emotion. Gaines didn't flinch. His gaze remained steady, unwavering. "Then say it," he pressed, his voice calm but insistent. "Say what you're afraid to say." Nathan's jaw tightened, a flash of defiance flickering across his face, but then his shoulders sagged, the fight draining from him. His hands trembled as he reached out to his mother, her arm still resting close by. She flinched slightly at the gesture, but she didn't pull away. "I'm sorry, Mom," Nathan whispered, his voice barely a murmur. "I've been so angry, and I took it out on you. You didn't deserve that." Tears slipped down the woman's cheeks as she looked at him, her expression softening. "Oh, Nathan," she said, her voice breaking. "You're my son. I've always forgiven you. But hearing you say this, it means so much." A collective sigh seemed to pass through the bus, the air lightening slightly. A few passengers exchanged glances, their eyes glossy with unshed tears. Even the teenager who had been recording stopped and lowered her phone, her previous smirk replaced by something gentler. Nathan wasn't done, though. He turned back to Gaines, his voice steadier now, carrying a sincerity that had been absent before. "Thank you," he said, the gratitude clear. I didn't. I didn't realize how much I was taking her for granted. Hearing your story, it hit me. Gaines nodded, his expression softening, yet there was an edge to his words. It's not easy to admit when you're wrong, he said. But what matters is what you do next. Words are just the beginning. Nathan's gaze dropped, a shadow of shame still lingering. I want to do better, he said quietly, his voice full of quiet resolve. For her. The elderly woman placed a hand over his, her fingers trembling but warm. We'll figure it out, she said, her voice steady with hope, filled with a mother's love. Gaines stepped back, his towering frame retreating, and for a moment, the bus seemed to breathe, the atmosphere shifting. He glanced around at the passengers, catching the eyes of a few who nodded, their expressions full of respect. Just as the mood began to lighten, something unexpected happened. The bus stopped at a red light, and a voice from the back startled everyone. Young man, called out an elderly voice, gravely but strong enough to be heard by all. The old man near the emergency exit, someone who had been overlooked until now, leaned forward. You've taken the first step. Don't stop now. All eyes turned to him as he adjusted his flat cap and continued, his tone firm yet not unkind. I lost my son a few years ago, he said. We hadn't spoken in over a decade. Do you know what I'd give for just 5 more minutes to tell him how much I loved him? Don't waste the time you've got. Nathan's face flushed a deeper red, his eyes brimming with tears he couldn't hold back. He glanced at his mother, her hand still resting gently on his, and for the first time in what felt like forever, there was no judgment in her eyes, only understanding. Nathan stood up abruptly, taking her hand in his voice trembling but steady. Come on, Mom, he said, let's get off here. I want to talk. Really talk. The passengers parted to let them through, some offering soft smiles, others nodding in encouragement as they exited the bus. A quiet murmur of approval rippled through the crowd, the moment not just one of personal reconciliation but shared understanding. Gaines watched them leave, his expression unreadable, but as the doors closed behind them, he allowed himself a small, satisfied smile. The weight of his own unspoken words had, in some small way, made a difference. As the bus continued its journey, the teenage girl who had been recording hesitated before deleting the video. Not everything needs to go online, she muttered to her friend, who nodded in agreement. The hum of conversation returned, but the air had changed. People weren't distracted by their phones or lost in their own worlds anymore. They were thinking, reflecting on the fragility of time, on forgiveness, on family. When the bus neared Gaines's stop, the man next to him spoke quietly. That was something back there, he said. The way you handled that. It made me think. I haven't called my mom in weeks. I think I'll do that tonight. Gaines smiled faintly as he stood up. You should, he said, his voice low but carrying the weight of his own lessons learned. One call can make all the difference. As he stepped off the bus and into the sunlight, the passengers watched him go. His quiet strength had left an indelible impression on them, one they wouldn't soon forget. The story reminds us all, time with loved ones is precious, and the words we speak can shape the bonds we share. So, take a moment today. Reach out to someone you love. Say the words you've been meaning to say.